The room didn't explode when my father said it. It went dead quiet. "She never served," he hissed, voice sharp enough to cut. "She stole our family name. Every story she tells is a lie." I didn't flinch. I didn't look at him. I looked straight at the judge. For a long second, nothing moved. Then the judge stood. Slowly, deliberately. Her chair scraped once against the floor, and she reached for the collar of her robe. The sound of fabric shifting filled the silence. That's when I knew the truth was finally about to speak for itself. I learned a long time ago that silence can be heavier than shouting. It presses down on your chest, makes you aware of every breath, every blink. That courtroom silence felt like that, dense, expectant, almost alive. The kind that doesn't come from confusion but from something on the edge of being revealed. 2 days earlier, I'd been standing in my kitchen barefoot on cold tile when the envelope arrived. Thick paper, county seal. My last name printed in a font that always looks more official than it should. I knew the courthouse well enough to recognize the look of a summons before I opened it. Petition fraudulent representation of military service. Plaintiff Daniel Hale, defendant Rebecca Hale. My father, suing me, not for money, not for property, for my name. I laughed once quietly, not because it was funny, but because my body didn't know what else to do with the shock. My coffee had gone cold in my hand. Outside, the oak tree in the yard creaked in the wind, its branches tapping the siding like a slow, impatient knock. Fraudulent representation, as if honor were something you could steal like a wallet. I folded the paper carefully and set it on the table. My dog Mason limped over and leaned his weight against my shin. He'd picked up that limp years ago, same year I picked up mine. We matched that way, two bodies that never quite moved the same after everything they'd been through. "Looks like we're going back," I told him. It had been 13 years since I'd last sat across from my father without a uniform between us. 13 years since he'd looked at me and said flat and final, "If you do this, don't use my name." I did it anyway. I served quietly. That's the part people never understand. They think service is parades and flags and loud gratitude. Mine was schedules, logistics, and nights where sleep came in short, broken pieces. It was responsibility without applause. Work that didn't make headlines but kept other people breathing. When I came home for good, I didn't announce it. No banners, no phone calls. Just a duffel bag, a knee that stiffened when it rained, and a habit of waking before dawn because my body didn't know any other way to exist. I rented a small place near the river, fixed what was broken, kept my head down. The only thing I kept visible was the name on my mailbox, Hale. Same as it had always been, same as my grandfather's who taught me how to tie knots and sharpen blades and tell the truth even when it costs you something. The night I got the summons, I pulled the old footlocker out from the closet. It still smelled faintly of metal and oil. Inside were papers I hadn't touched in years, records, letters, photographs that curled at the edges no matter how carefully I stored them. I didn't open everything. I didn't need to. Truth doesn't require rehearsal. The next morning I called the clerk's office. Her voice was polite, practiced. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "Your father is claiming you falsely represented military service for personal gain." "For what gain?" I asked. There was a pause. Paper shifting. "The filing doesn't specify." Of course it didn't. My father never needed specifics. He only needed to be right. I drove past his house that afternoon. Didn't stop. The place looked smaller than it used to, the fence leaning where it hadn't before. The flag on the porch hung limp, faded from years of sun. That flag had been his shield, his proof of loyalty, even though he'd never worn a uniform himself. My grandfather had. That mattered to him. It mattered to me too. The night before the hearing, I pressed my clothes and laid everything out with care. Not ceremony, just respect. Mason watched from the doorway, ears perked as if he knew tomorrow meant something different. I didn't sleep much. I never do before things that matter. The courthouse sat low and square against the morning sky bricks, worn smooth by decades of footsteps. I arrived early. Always early. Habit. Inside, the air smelled like floor cleaner and old paper. A bailiff nodded when he saw me, eyes flicking briefly to my posture before returning to his clipboard. My father was already there. He stood when he saw me, jaw tight, shoulders squared like he was bracing for impact. He looked older than I remembered. Not weaker, just worn the way metal wears after too much strain. My mother sat beside him, hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead, as if the room itself had offended her. Neither of them spoke. When the judge entered the room, Rose. She was smaller than I expected, gray hair pulled back neatly, movements precise. Her eyes moved over the room once, then paused just briefly on me. There was no expression there, just attention. The case was called. My name sounded different in that space, heavier. My father didn't wait for his attorney to finish. He leaned forward, voice sharp with years of stored resentment. She never served, he said. She used our name, lied about everything. I felt the words hit the air and hang there waiting for a reaction. I didn't give one. I looked at the judge. That's when she stood. And that's where the story truly begins. The judge didn't speak right away after my father's accusation. She remained standing, hands resting lightly on the edge of the bench, eyes moving from him to me and back again. Then without comment, she sat down and adjusted her glasses. Mr. Hale, she said calmly, you'll have time to present your claims. For now, please let your counsel speak. My father didn't like that. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers curled against the wooden rail. Control had always been his language, and silence, especially enforced silence, felt like an insult to him. His attorney rose, a local man with a tidy haircut and a voice trained to sound confident even when the facts were thin. He spoke about reputations, about legacy, about how my father's family name had been used publicly in connection with stories of military service that could not be verified. Could not be verified, not false, just inconvenient. As he spoke, my mind drifted backward to the first time my father accused me of stealing something that wasn't his to give. I was 19, standing in the garage where he kept his tools arranged like a private museum, wrenches hung by size, screwdrivers lined up like soldiers. He held my acceptance letter in his hand as if it were evidence of a crime. You don't get to wear that name and do this, he said. Do what I asked. Leave. Pretend you're something you're not. That was the night I learned how deeply he believed ownership extended to land, to objects, to people, especially to daughters. When I enlisted, he told the neighbors I'd moved away for school. When I deployed, he told them nothing at all. Silence was easier than admitting he didn't understand me, easier than admitting his idea of strength didn't match mine. The attorney finished. The judge nodded once and turned to me. Ms. Hale, she said, do you wish to respond? I stood. My knee protested a dull ache that reminded me where I'd been and what I'd carried home. I didn't rush. There's a rhythm to standing your ground, and it doesn't like to be hurried. Yes, Your Honor, I said. I brought documentation. I placed the folder on the table. No flourish, no speech, just paper, thick, unremarkable, undeniable. My father scoffed softly. Paper can say anything. The judge raised a hand. You'll refrain from commentary, sir. Her eyes moved back to me. Proceed. I opened the folder and slid out the first page. Service record, dates, unit, signature. I didn't explain it. I didn't need to. The document explained itself. The courtroom was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Less sharp, more focused. As the judge reviewed the papers, I thought about my grandfather. He never talked much about his time in uniform, but he kept his boots clean long after he stopped wearing them. He believed that some things didn't belong to stories. They belonged to memory. When he died, my father took his flag and put it in a case above the fireplace. He never asked if I wanted it. I never asked for it either. Some battles aren't worth winning if the cost is becoming someone you don't recognize. The judge looked up. Mr. Hale, she said, were you aware of your daughter's service records? My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. She never told us. I met his eyes for the first time that day. You never asked. The words came out steady, but they landed harder than I expected. My mother flinched just slightly. It was the first crack I'd seen in her composure in years. The judge set the folder aside. This court will review all submitted materials. Until then, I'd advise both parties to remember that allegations of dishonor are serious matters. Dishonor, the word echoed in my head. I'd seen dishonor before. I'd seen it in men who abandoned their posts, in leaders who chose convenience over responsibility. I'd also seen honor in places people never looked, in quiet endurance, in showing up when no one was watching. My father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed as if daring the room to challenge him. I realized then that this case wasn't about truth to him. It was about authority, about reclaiming control over a narrative he felt had slipped out of his hands. The judge announced a brief recess. In the hallway, people moved carefully around us, glancing and then looking away. A woman about my mother's age nodded at me as she passed. A man in a worn veteran's cap gave a small salute. I returned it without thinking. My mother stood a few feet away, hands clasped around her purse. She looked at me as if she wanted to say something, then didn't. Silence had always been her refuge. When court resumed, the judge returned with the same measured calm. She asked for additional verification, requested official confirmation from the appropriate records office. Routine, procedural, fair. My father shifted, irritation creeping into his posture. "This is unnecessary," he muttered. The judge's gaze sharpened. "On the contrary, Mr. Hale, truth deserves patience." As she spoke, her sleeve slipped slightly, revealing a thin band of metal around her wrist. Not jewelry. Something else. Something worn, not decorative. I noticed it, so did my father. He frowned, confusion flickering across his face. The judge caught his look. For just a moment, something like recognition passed through her eyes. Then she straightened. "We'll continue once verification is complete," she said. "Until then, this court is adjourned." Her gavel struck. The sound echoed longer than it should have. As people began to file out, my father leaned toward me, voice low and sharp. "You think paperwork makes you something you're not." I met his stare evenly. "No, it just proves what you refuse to see." He opened his mouth to respond, but the bailiff stepped closer, presence firm and unyielding. My father fell silent. Outside, the sky had clouded over the light, dull and heavy. I breathed it in, steadying myself. This wasn't over. I could feel it in my bones. Back inside, through the courtroom doors, I saw the judge standing alone at the bench, her robe draped over the chair behind her. For a second, she rested a hand on it, fingers lingering as if on something familiar. And I understood then that the moment my father feared, the moment he tried to prevent by shouting and accusing, was still coming. The truth hadn't raised its voice yet. But it was standing. The rain started sometime during the lunch recess, a thin, steady drizzle that blurred the courthouse windows and softened the edges of everything outside. I watched it from a bench near the vending machine's hands, wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that tasted faintly of burnt plastic. Across the hall, my father stood with his attorney, speaking in clipped sentences, shoulders tight, as if the weather itself had personally offended him. I didn't join them. I never had. Instead, I thought about the first town I'd been stationed in, how the rain there smelled like iron and salt, how you learn to read the sky the way some people read faces. You learn early that storms announce themselves quietly before they arrive. A shift in pressure. A wrongness in the air. This case had felt like that from the start. When the clerk called us back in, the courtroom looked smaller than it had earlier, as if the walls had moved in while no one was watching. People settled into their seats with the careful movements of those who sensed they were about to witness something they didn't fully understand. The judge entered without ceremony. Her robe hung neatly, now restored to its place, but something about her posture had changed. She carried herself the way people do when they've made a decision and accepted its weight. "We've received preliminary verification," she said, taking her seat. "Before we proceed, I want to clarify the scope of this hearing." She looked directly at my father. "This court is not here to adjudicate feelings or family grievances. We are here to determine whether allegations of fraudulent representation have merit." My father nodded stiffly. "That's exactly what I want." I almost smiled, almost. The judge turned to me. "Ms. Hale, are you currently employed?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And does your employment involve public representation of military service?" I considered the question carefully. I speak occasionally at community events, veteran support groups, schools, when asked. "Do you receive compensation for these appearances?" "No, ma'am." She nodded, "Thank you." The attorney for my father rose again, launching into a rehearsed argument about implied benefit, about the social capital of military status. He used phrases like borrowed valor and unearned trust, letting them hang in the air like smoke. I listened without interrupting. That was another thing service teaches you: not every attack requires a counterstrike. Sometimes you let the other side reveal itself. When he finished, the judge leaned back slightly, fingers steepled. "Mr. Hale," she said, "your claim rests on the assertion that your daughter falsely represented service. Yet documentation submitted thus far indicates otherwise." My father's face reddened. Paper can be forged. The judge's gaze sharpened. "Are you alleging fraud against federal records?" He hesitated. "I'm saying I don't recognize the person she claims to be." The room went still. That was the real accusation, not about service, about identity. I felt it then, not anger, but something older, the ache of being unseen by the people who should have known you best. I'd carried that ache through deserts and sleepless nights, through moments when the easiest thing would have been to let it harden me. I didn't let it show. The judge studied my father for a long moment. "Recognition," she said quietly, "is not a legal standard." She turned to the clerk. "Please place the verification report on the record." The clerk stood, voice clear, as she read confirmation from the records office. Dates, units, commendations, medical discharge notes, all of it said out loud, stripped of drama, reduced to facts. Each word landed like a small weight on the bench between us. My mother stared straight ahead. My father's jaw worked as if he were chewing something bitter. When the clerk finished, the judge thanked her and removed her glasses. She set them down carefully, then stood. This time there was no hesitation. "I'm going to step down from the bench briefly," she said. "What I'm about to say does not change my role here, but it does provide context." A murmur rippled through the room. She reached behind her and lifted the robe from the chair, folding it once then again with deliberate care. Beneath it, she wore a plain navy suit. On her lapel was a small pin, subtle, easily overlooked. A gold star. The air shifted. I felt it in my chest before my mind caught up. "I served for 12 years, she continued, voice steady. "Before law school, before this bench. I didn't talk about it much then, and I don't now. But I know what service looks like when it's real." My father stared at her, stunned. "I also know what false accusations do," she said. "They don't just question facts. They question dignity." She replaced the robe on the chair but didn't put it back on. Instead, she stood there, unshielded by fabric authority, intact. "This court finds no evidence of fraudulent representation by Ms. Hale," she said. "On the contrary, the evidence confirms her service and her right to speak truthfully about her experiences." She looked at my father. "Mr. Hale, your petition is denied." The gavel came down once, solid, final. For a moment, no one moved. Then the sound of breath returned to the room. My father stood abruptly. "You can't." The bailiff stepped forward. "Sir." My father stopped. His shoulders sagged slightly, as if something had finally slipped loose. I gathered my papers slowly. My hands trembled just a little, not from fear but from release, the kind that comes when you realize you no longer have to carry a weight alone. As I turned to leave, the judge spoke again, softer this time. "Ms. Hale." I looked back. "Thank you for your restraint," she said. "It speaks louder than any argument." I nodded once. Outside, the rain had eased. The air smelled clean washed. My mother caught up to me on the steps, her heels clicking unevenly. "I didn't know," she said, voice barely above a whisper. I met her eyes. "I know." She nodded, tears gathering but not falling. "Your father, he doesn't know how to be wrong." "I know that too." She hesitated, then reached out, brushing my sleeve in a gesture so familiar it hurt. "Be careful," she said, "with all of this." I watched her go back inside. As I walked toward my car, I passed the judge standing under the awning, rain dripping softly around her. She met my gaze and gave a small nod. Not formal, not personal, just acknowledgement. That was enough. The storm had passed. But something else, something quieter and far more lasting, had just begun. By the time I reached my car, the courthouse steps were nearly empty. The rain had thinned to a mist, the kind that settles on your shoulders without asking permission. I sat behind the wheel for a moment without starting, the engine, hands resting on my thighs, letting the quiet come back. Inside, the case was over. On paper, I was cleared, officially, undeniably, but families don't run on paper. I didn't drive home right away. Instead, I pulled onto the long road that cut past the river, the one my grandfather used to take when he needed to think. The water ran high from the rain, brown and steady, carrying leaves and broken twigs downstream without hesitation. It reminded me of something he once told me when I was still young enough to ask questions out loud. Truth doesn't rush, he'd said, staring at the current. It moves when it's ready. I was halfway down that road when my phone buzzed. Dad. I let it ring, not out of spite, out of instinct. Some conversations need space before they can breathe. The voicemail came through a minute later. His voice was tight, controlled in that brittle way it got when he was trying not to lose ground. You embarrassed this family, he said. That judge had no right to make a spectacle. If you think this ends here, you're wrong. I stared at the phone screen until it went dark. So that was it. Even stripped of authority, even faced with proof, he still needed a battlefield. That night, the local paper ran a short piece. No names in the headline, just a few lines about a dismissed petition and a judge's rare but pointed commentary on false accusations. In a town like ours, that was enough. By morning, people knew. The hardware store clerk nodded at me with new understanding. A woman at the diner squeezed my hand when she poured my coffee. A man I'd never met said quietly, "Good on you," and meant it. I didn't tell anyone how heavy that kindness felt. Validation arrives late sometimes, and when it does, it can bruise just as much as it heals. The next day, a letter arrived at my door. My father's handwriting, tight, angular. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the counter and fed Mason watched him eat with the slow dedication of an animal that had learned patience the hard way. When I finally broke the seal, the letter was shorter than I expected. You humiliated me in that courtroom. People are talking. You could have stopped it. If you had any respect for this family, you would have handled it privately. I want you to stop using our name in public. I read it twice, then once more. He still believed the name belonged to him. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't tear it up. Anger burns fast. I wanted something slower. That afternoon, I drove out to the old property line, the strip of land my grandfather had kept, long after everyone else thought it useless. He'd called it breathing room, said every family needed a place where no one else could tell you who you were. The gate creaked as I opened it. The fence leaned boards, weathered but stubborn. I ran a hand along the wood, feeling the grooves worn smooth by time. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low and far off. I heard a truck before I saw it. My father pulled in slowly, parking just inside the gate. He sat there for a moment before getting out, hands braced on the door as if steadying himself. He looked smaller here, out in the open, without walls or witnesses. "So this is where you ran off to," he said. "I didn't run," I replied. "I came here to think." He snorted. "You always did that. Thought too much." We stood a few feet apart, the space between us thick with years we'd never managed to cross. The wind tugged at his jacket. He didn't zip it. "You think you won," he said, "but all you did was make me look like a fool." I met his gaze evenly. "You did that yourself." His eyes flashed. "Don't talk to me like that." "Like what I asked, honestly?" Silence stretched, the kind that forces choices. "You wore that name into places it didn't belong," he said finally. "People look at me differently now." I took a slow breath. "People look at you differently because you tried to take something that wasn't yours." He shook his head, disbelief etched deep. "Everything you have came from this family." "No," I said quietly. "What I have came from what I did when no one was watching." That landed. I saw it in the way his shoulders tightened, the way his eyes dropped to the ground between us. "You could have stayed," he muttered. "You could have been normal." I thought of nights in far-off places, of decisions made under pressure, of people whose names I still carried with me. Normal had never been the point. "I stayed true," I said. "That was the choice." For a long moment he said nothing. Then, unexpectedly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a folded piece of cloth worn thin at the edges. He held it out, not quite meeting my eyes. "Your grandfather's," he said. "He told me to give it to you one day. I never thought—" Well, I unfolded it carefully. A small service flag, faded, hand-stitched. I remembered it from my childhood, tucked away in a drawer he only opened on quiet nights. "I should have given this to you years ago," my father said. His voice cracked on the last word. I didn't rush him. I didn't fill the silence. He exhaled slowly. I don't know how to be proud without feeling like I'm losing something. I looked at him then, not as an opponent, not as a judge, but as a man who had confused control with love for too long. You don't lose it, I said, you pass it on. He nodded once, not agreement, not apology, something in between. When he left, the gate creaked closed behind him. I stayed there until the sky darkened, the first stars breaking through the clouds. Back home, I placed the flag on the table and sat with it for a long time. The courtroom felt far away now, like a chapter already closing. Justice had spoken, quietly, clearly. What came next would be slower, harder. But for the first time, it would be honest. The days that followed settled into a strange stillness, the kind that comes after a storm has passed, but the ground hasn't quite dried. People assumed the hardest part was over once the judge's decision became public. They were wrong. The verdict ended the case. It didn't end the reckoning. I kept busy on purpose. Mornings started early, coffee Mason's slow circuit of the yard, the stretch that coaxed my knee into cooperation. I fixed what needed fixing, replaced a loose hinge, cleared brush along the fence line. Honest work has a way of keeping your mind from circling the same dark questions. By midweek, the courthouse clerk called. Her voice was careful, respectful, in a way that felt new. Ms. Hale, Judge Whitmore asked me to pass along a message. The final order has been filed. She also wanted you to know she hesitated. That what you did mattered, not just to the case. I thanked her and hung up, staring at the wall longer than necessary. I didn't need praise, but I understood what she meant. In small towns, false accusations don't just bruise the accused. They teach everyone else what kind of cruelty is acceptable. Letting the truth stand without shouting had shifted something, quietly, permanently. That afternoon, a knock came at the door. 2 quick raps, then a pause. I opened it to find Mrs. Ellison from 3 houses down, her gray hair, pinned neatly, hands folded around a paper bag. I baked too much, she said, not meeting my eyes. Thought you might help me fix that. I took the bag, banana bread still warm, thank you. She lingered, then added, my brother served Vietnam. He didn't talk about it much either. She nodded once and turned away. Word traveled like that, sideways, careful, respectful. No one asked for details. No one demanded a story. They didn't need one anymore. On Friday, I drove back to town to pick up supplies. At the hardware store, I felt eyes on me, not curious, not suspicious, considerate. The clerk rang up my nails and lumber and said, your grandfather would be proud. Just that. Nothing else. I loaded the truck and sat for a moment, hands on the wheel, letting the words land. Pride used to feel like a trap. Now it felt like something earned, then released. When I got home, there was another letter, not from my father this time, from the county mediation office. A routine notice, option for family reconciliation services. Voluntary, confidential, recommended after intra-family disputes. I smiled despite myself. Bureaucracy always arrives late to the truth, clipboard in hand. That night, I took the small service flag my father had given me and placed it beside the old footlocker. I didn't frame it. I didn't mount it on the wall. Some things are meant to be held, not displayed. The following Sunday morning, I woke to a text. Mom, are you home? I stared at the screen, thumb hovering. Then, yes. An hour later, their car pulled into the driveway. My father didn't get out right away. My mother did. She stood there for a second, smoothing her sweater as if bracing herself. You look tired, she said. So do you. We shared a small, careful smile. She stepped inside and glanced around, taking in the ordinary details, Mason's bed by the door, the scuffed table, the quiet order of the place. Your father's in the car, she said softly. He didn't sleep much. I can imagine. She touched my arm. Whatever happens, I want you to know. I'm glad you didn't yell. I'm glad you didn't make it ugly. I nodded. Me too. My father finally came in. He stood just inside the doorway, hands at his sides, eyes taking inventory the way he always did. For a moment, none of us spoke. I saw the order, he said at last. It's done. Yes, I replied, it is. He cleared his throat. People are still talking. They will, I said, then they won't. That seemed to surprise him. He studied me, searching for something, defiance maybe, or permission. I don't like how it happened, he said, but I can't say you were wrong. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't nothing either. We sat at the table. My mother poured tea. The kettle clicked off with a familiar sound that pulled a memory loose nights when she used to do the same while my grandfather whittled at the counter shavings curling at his feet. I spoke to Judge Whitmore, my father said suddenly. Ran into her at the grocer. I raised an eyebrow. She didn't say much, he went on, just looked at me and said, "Words can wound long after the case is closed." Then she wished me a good day. I imagined the scene, the calm, the certainty. It fit. "I don't understand why you didn't fight back harder," he said. "You could have." I met his gaze, because winning wasn't the point. He frowned. Then what was... I thought about the courtroom, about the robe folded with care, about the sound of the gavel and the silence that followed. Being seen, I said, without becoming someone I didn't want to be. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Your grandfather used to say something like that." "I know," I said. "I learned it from him." The visit didn't last long. It didn't need to. When they left, my mother hugged me, brief, firm, real. My father paused at the door. "You keeping the name?" he asked. I didn't hesitate, yes. He nodded once, then, "Take care of it." After they drove away, I sat on the porch with Mason at my feet and watched the light shift across the yard. The world felt quieter, not empty, settled. Some stories end with vindication. This one didn't. It ended with space room to breathe, to rebuild, to decide what comes next without a judge or a gavel or an audience. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. The following week arrived quietly, as if it didn't want to draw attention to itself. No headlines, no phone calls from reporters who never came in the first place. Just mornings that started the same way they always had, coffee steaming in a chipped mug. Mason easing himself up from his bed, the house settling around us with familiar sounds. I thought the tension would vanish once the case ended. Instead, it changed shape. It moved inward, settling somewhere behind my ribs, asking questions that didn't have easy answers. What do you do after you're proven right when being right was never the goal? I drove back to the old property on Wednesday. Not because it needed anything urgent, but because I did. The gate still complained when I opened it. The fence still leaned like it had something to confess. I parked and walked the perimeter slowly, hand-brushing the posts, counting the steps the way I used to count breaths when things felt out of control. Halfway down the line, I noticed the new board. It was subtle, fresh wood among weathered gray. Someone had replaced it carefully, nails set straight, grain aligned with the rest. I knelt, running my fingers along the edge. On the inside face, where you'd only see it if you looked, were 2 letters carved shallow but deliberate. H. My grandfather's initials. I didn't hear the truck until it shut off. My father stood a few yards away, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes on the fence instead of me. He looked older than he had the week before, as if the effort of being angry had finally caught up with him. "I didn't want it to fall over," he said. "Figured I'd fix it before winter." I nodded. "Thank you." We stood there, both of us looking at the same stretch of land, seeing different histories layered on top of each other. He cleared his throat. "You know," he said, "when you were a kid, I used to think if I kept everything in order, tools, rules, names, nothing bad could get in." I waited. He didn't often speak this way, and interrupting felt like closing a door mid-sentence. "When you left," he continued, "it felt like disorder, like I'd failed at something I didn't know how to name." I turned toward him. "You didn't fail." He shook his head. "Maybe not, but I didn't know how to follow you either." That was as close as he'd ever come to admitting fear. Not regret, fear. "I saw the judge again," he said after a moment. "At the veterans' breakfast in town." She didn't recognize me at first. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Probably for the best. I pictured Judge Whitmore standing among folding tables and paper plates, her authority still present even without the robe. It made sense. Some people carry who they are no matter what they wear. "She told a story," my father went on. Didn't say it was hers. Just said she knew someone who kept quiet for years because they thought no one wanted to hear it. I said nothing. "She said silence isn't weakness," he finished. "It's a kind of discipline." That word again. Discipline. The bridge neither of us had known how to cross until now. He looked at me then. Really looked. I told myself, "You were pretending. Because if you weren't, then I'd been wrong for a very long time." I felt something loosen in my chest, not forgiveness, understanding. Sometimes that's the part that hurts most. You don't have to say anything, he added quickly, as if worried he'd said too much. I know, I replied, but I'm glad you did. We walked back toward the truck together. He stopped once, gesturing at the field. You keeping it? Yes. For good. For as long as it needs someone. He nodded, satisfied. At the truck, he reached inside and pulled out a small, worn envelope. He handed it to me without ceremony. Your grandfather wrote this, he said. Left it with me. I wasn't ready to give it to you before. I opened it carefully. The paper inside was thin edges, soft from age. If you're reading this, it began, then you've learned that honor doesn't belong to one voice. It belongs to the one who keeps showing up even when it costs them something. I swallowed. My father watched my face, searching for a reaction he didn't have words for. I folded the letter and slid it into my jacket. Thank you, I said. He nodded once. I won't bother you again, he added. Not like before. I met his eyes. You're welcome here. Just don't come looking for a fight. A corner of his mouth twitched. Never was good at winning those anyway. He drove off a few minutes later, the sound of his truck fading down the road. I stayed by the fence, listening to the wind move through the grass, feeling the weight of the letter against my chest. That night I sat on the porch with Mason, the letter open on my lap. The sky was clear stars, sharp and bright. I thought about the courtroom, the accusation, the stillness, the judge standing without her robe. About how the loudest moment hadn't been my father's shout, but the quiet that followed when no one believed him anymore. Truth doesn't need noise, it needs time. I realized then that the case hadn't ended my story. It had given it back to me, untangled it from someone else's fear and set it down where I could choose what to do next. I folded the letter and placed it in the footlocker beside the service flag. Not as evidence, as inheritance. Some legacies are claimed, others are earned. The first frost came early that year, a thin white line tracing the edges of the field before the sun had fully decided whether to stay. I stood on the porch with my coffee warming my hands, watching Mason nose at the grass like it had personally offended him. The air smelled clean, sharp enough to wake old memories. Life didn't transform overnight after the case. There was no sudden peace, no cinematic release where everything clicked into place. Instead, there was rhythm, work, rest, small decisions made without anyone else's voice in my head. A week after my father fixed the fence, a letter arrived from the local high school. An invitation to speak for Veterans Week. No pressure, just a request. I stared at the envelope longer than necessary before opening it. I'd said no to things like this before, not out of fear but because I didn't want to become a symbol someone else could misinterpret. But something about this felt different. Maybe because the accusation had already been spoken aloud and survived the truth. I agreed. The gym smelled like old wood and floor polish. Teenagers shifted in their seats, restless, curious. The principal introduced me simply. No embellishment, no medals listed. I stood at the microphone and looked out at faces still deciding who they wanted to be. I used to think honor was about being loud, I said. About making sure everyone knew what you'd done. I paused, letting the silence do its work. I was wrong. Honor is what you keep when no one's clapping. I didn't talk about the courtroom. I didn't talk about my father. I talked about showing up, about responsibility, about choosing truth even when it costs you something you thought you needed. When I finished, the room stayed quiet for a beat. Then a few kids stood, not all, just enough. That was more than enough. Later that evening, I drove back to the property. The porch light flicked on as I pulled in something my father had rewired without mentioning it. I smiled at the smallness of the gesture, the way it said more than any apology ever could. I sat on the steps with Mason and watched the sky darken. The service flag rested folded beside me, the letter from my grandfather tucked safely away. Somewhere down the road, a truck passed its headlights, sweeping briefly across the field before disappearing. I thought about the judge, about the way she'd stood and set aside her robe not to diminish her authority, but to remind everyone that truth doesn't depend on costumes. It depends on courage. I thought about my father learning slowly that letting go doesn't mean losing. Sometimes it means finally seeing what's been there all along. And I thought about the accusation that started it all. She never served. She stole our name. The truth had answered without shouting. It always does. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever been misunderstood or accused or forced to stand quietly while someone tried to rewrite who you are, I want you to know this. You don't have to scream to be heard. Live it. Let time do the talking. I'd love to hear what this story meant to you. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. We share stories like this every day, stories about dignity, family, and the kind of justice that doesn't make noise but lasts. If you don't want to miss the next one, subscribe and stay with us. Let's keep walking this road together.